Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 2, Section 2 of your text, which has to do with the properties of water. Before we get started, there is a corresponding Power Notes sheet. It looks like this. You can see the chapter and section at the top. There is this diagram of water molecules here, and so you'll probably want to have this nearby so that you can take your notes as we discuss the presentation today. So it's important for us to put the properties of water into context. This is a biology class. We're studying living things. And so the reason why the properties of water are so important is because if you think of you as an organism, or really any organism, we are mostly water. There is water in and around all of our cells, and that water plays a very important role. You do see over here, it forms our saliva. We have mucous membranes lining like our esophagus and the inside of our nose leading into our lungs. Our body waste, we flush out using water. We're converting food. It's helping in digestion. It's regulating body temperature. All of these things here are really important features of water molecules inside of our cells. So we're also going to think about this on the Earth level or the ecosystem level, because ecosystems on Earth are also very reliant on water. So some of the aspects of water we will discuss in terms of the impact on the overall ecosystem or Earth. So we're going to begin by looking at this water molecule itself. Water is what we call a polar molecule, and polar meaning it has two opposite poles, kind of like the Earth has a north pole and a south pole. The water molecule has two poles, but these are electrical poles. They're not magnetic, but they're in terms of electrical charge. We have a negative side and we have a positive side. So make sure that you understand the meaning of that term polar. On your Power Notes sheet, you do have a place to describe what exactly is a polar molecule, and this would be a molecule that has two opposite charged sides, like a water molecule. So we're also seeing that this water molecule here has one oxygen, two hydrogens. We discussed that in the POGIL. We discussed the fact that there's a covalent bond, sharing of electrons between oxygen and hydrogen. So this covalent bond is a sharing of electrons, but remember how we had discussed it being an unequal sharing? So the electrons are going to spend more time around the oxygen, giving it that partial negative charge. So I do want to make sure that you're understanding on that note sheet here. We have this diagram. So between oxygen and hydrogen here, this would be our covalent bond, right? So if we are identifying this atom, this is our oxygen, and the oxygen is going to have the negative charge. And then on a separate molecule here, we now have the box pointing to what is this atom? Well, that is going to be our hydrogen. And we know the hydrogen has a slightly positive charge. So make sure that we have the correct orientation as to the oxygen and hydrogen here. Now, the covalent bonds are the bonds that are forming between this oxygen and this hydrogen over here. So we would normally draw that with a solid line, right? If we were to draw that water molecule without the circles representing the different elements. These other bonds here, make sure you're not labeling that as a covalent bond. These dashed lines are not what we are referring to as the covalent bond. The covalent bond would be this line here between oxygen and hydrogen. So in order to look at those dashed lines and what they represent, back on our slide here, the hydrogen bonds are going to form between the slightly positive hydrogen and the slightly negative oxygen. So those dashed lines are the hydrogen bonds. This diagram shows that in a little more detail here. So now we're seeing kind of a 3D representation of a water molecule in the center, oxygen and two hydrogens. We do see the solid line here. Those are the covalent bonds. And then we see these dotted lines. These dotted lines are the hydrogen bonds. So on your power notes sheet, make sure that you are identifying this bond as the hydrogen bond. Now, it's called a hydrogen bond, but the word bond in there is actually a little misleading because it is just a weak attraction. It is nowhere near as strong as the covalent bond between this oxygen and hydrogen. That is a much, much stronger attraction. These are weak attractions, the hydrogen bonds. Notice also that the hydrogen bonds are forming between different molecules. So this one molecule here is covalently bonded together, but if you compare this molecule with its neighbor, there's a weak attraction between them, and that weak attraction is the hydrogen bond. So when we're looking at the properties of water, really what it all comes down to is the fact that water molecules do form those hydrogen bonds, and the hydrogen bonds are responsible for the three properties of water that make it such a unique compound. And we're going to talk about each of these properties in a little more detail. They are, and there's a place to list it on your power notes sheet, the high specific heat of water, cohesion, and adhesion. So let's talk a little bit more about what those three things are. Cohesion is when you have water molecules attracted to other water molecules. Co means together. So if you have water sticking to other water molecules, that is cohesion. And this is going to lead us to the surface tension that is present on the surface of water. So you can see in this diagram here, all of these circles represent water molecules, and the arrows represent the attraction from one molecule to the next. Now, all of the lower water molecules, see how there's 4 different directions that they're attracted to other molecules? But look at the top. Across the surface, there's nothing above it to hydrogen bond to. So that means that there are enhanced or more hydrogen bonds between this water molecule and the one right next to it. And that's why you see the double arrows across the top. So there's slightly enhanced hydrogen bonding at the surface of any water, a body of water, a drop of water. The reason why water forms these drops on the surface of a leaf here in this picture is because the surface tension, all of the water molecules around the outside edge of this drop have a slightly enhanced attraction due to the cohesion between them and the water molecules around them. Adhesion is another property of water that involves the water molecules being attracted to something, but in the case of adhesion, they are attracted to something different, meaning they're attracted to non-water molecules. That could be the side of a glass. If you have ever tried to pour water out of a glass before and it ran down the side of the glass, you can thank adhesion for that. The water molecules stuck to the glass, and that would be adhesion because glass is not the same as water. It also happens inside of plant stems. The water, as it's being soaked up in this celery stalk, is sticking to the inside vessels of that plant. So that would be another example of adhesion. In this lab example in the middle, we can see the water is actually climbing up the inside of this tube because these tubes are made out of glass and the water molecules like to stick to the glass. So it's climbing up the tube here because of that adhesion between the water molecules and the glass surface. And finally, high specific heat. If you were to summarize the specific heat of water, it's really just the idea of water being difficult to change temperature. This is a good thing to think about if you've ever tried to boil a pot of water on the stove. And you've probably heard the expression, a watched pot never boils, because it seems to take forever for that pot to reach the actual boiling point. That's because that pot of water, the water inside of it, has a very high specific heat. And that means it requires a lot of energy to change its temperature. So this is going to help on the earth level because there's so much water on the surface of the earth. It helps to regulate the earth's temperature, but this also helps us on an organism level inside of our bodies. It's difficult to change our body temperature because we do consist of a majority water if you were to look at the molecules inside of our cells. So that's going to help us maintain homeostasis. So there's some additional properties of water that are going to be important for living things. And one of them is the idea that ice floats. And the floating of ice is really important if you happen to be an aquatic organism that lives in a cold area. That layer of ice will form at the surface, but it will leave the liquid water underneath. Now, the reason why ice floats is because you have to really think about the states of matter. Liquid water, solid water, and water vapor, which would be the gaseous form of water. They can all exist on Earth. So this is kind of unique in terms of molecules because it's very natural for us to have all three states of water on the surface of the Earth. Now you see in this slide, there is a comparison between what water molecules look like in the solid state, what they look like in the liquid state, and what they look like in the gaseous state. And it's pretty clear that in that solid water state, which would be ice, those water molecules are very neatly arranged into this crystalline structure. So basically, the difference between these three states of matter has to do with how warm the water is, right? If we heat water up to a very high heat, it evaporates and turns into steam or water vapor. And that means that each individual water molecule is moving very quickly. That's what temperature is, right? The higher the temperature, the more molecular motion there is. So in this case, the water molecules are moving so quickly that they really don't have an opportunity to form hydrogen bonds with each other. So they're going to be really spread out. Well, look at the liquid water. Liquid water is moving more quickly than the molecules in solid water. However, they don't move so quickly that they can't hydrogen bond. So they form lots of hydrogen bonds, and all of those bonds together are going to really cause that water to pull in and become much more dense than in the gaseous state that you see here. But an interesting thing happens when that liquid water freezes into a solid. Since those water molecules move even slower, they start to arrange themselves into a neat, orderly fashion, which is going to allow them to form that crystal structure, and that actually pushes the molecules farther away from each other. So now we have the same number of molecules, but they're taking up a larger space that is making the ice less dense than the liquid water. Now, before we move on, I do want to call your attention to the Power Notes sheet because what we just discussed is actually on the back where it has questions. Why does ice float in liquid water? So make sure you go back and fill in some information here based on what we just discussed. If you need to go back and listen to it again, feel free to do that. So the next thing we need to talk about in regards to water is how it dissolves things. And it's important to make sure we have the proper terminology first. And the terminology that we need to know is the term solution, solvent, and solute. A solution is going to be the thing that is formed when you have some substance dissolving something else. So if we have a solution in this beaker of sugar water, what that means is the components of the solution would be a solvent, which in this example would be water. The water is the liquid that does the dissolving, and the solute would be the molecules of sugar. Those are the things that are being dissolved, would be the solute. So make sure you're not confusing the term solvent and solute or the term solution. The reason why this is important in terms of water is because water is sometimes called the universal solvent. Now that is not literally true. It does not actually dissolve everything in the universe, because in chemistry there is this term like dissolves like, which means polar things such as water can dissolve other polar things. So sugar, for example, in our last slide is a polar molecule. It has lots of polar side groups on it, and that means that water can dissolve sugar. But things that are nonpolar are not going to be easily dissolved by water. So we've talked about what polar means, but I do want to make sure that we discuss nonpolar. This was on the power notes sheet. You may have noticed. We didn't skip it. I didn't forget about it here. We do have a place for you to write down what nonpolar is. A nonpolar molecule is the opposite of a polar molecule. We know that this water, the oxygen, has a partial negative charge. The hydrogens have partial positive charges, and that is what makes it polar. It's that separation of charges on one end to the other. But nonpolar molecules, they do not have opposite charges. So you can think of them as being completely neutral throughout. And a really good example here is going to be oil. Oil like olive oil that you might have in a salad dressing, that is going to be a great example of a nonpolar molecule. If we were to look at the molecule of oil, we would not see positive on one side and negative on the other side like we do for water. It would be completely neutral throughout because it has completely equal sharing of electrons all the way throughout that molecule. So back on our slide here, you can see that we have a chart and we're comparing something that's ionic. Ionic just means it has a full positive or negative charge, whereas polar means there's a partial positive and negative charge on opposite sides of the molecule. So anything that has any kind of charge, whether it's polar or fully ionic, fully charged, those things will dissolve each other very easily. But something that is nonpolar, it will only dissolve other nonpolar things. So if we have a beaker with water in it, we have all these hydrogen bonds between the water molecules because water is polar and the hydrogen of one molecule is attracted to the oxygen of another. We've talked about that a lot. In this oil molecule at the top, there is no positive, there is no negative, it's neutral throughout. So there's nothing that would cause it to be attracted to any of those water molecules. But the water molecules are very attracted to each other, so they stick together down in the bottom of the beaker, and the oil would float in a layer on the top because it cannot dissolve in water. Now, if we look at solutions from a pH standpoint, that's the final thing that we really need to discuss today, because water in organisms is not just pure water, it's water with stuff dissolved in it. And sometimes that makes it more acidic, sometimes it makes it more basic. So we need to talk about the pH scale, which is how we measure how acidic something is. If something is an acid, it is found lower on the pH scale. 7 would be here. 7 is neutral. Anything below 7, all the way down to 0, that would be considered an acid. Now, by definition, what makes it an acid is the fact that when you dissolve it in water, it releases hydrogen ions. Well, what does that mean? If it's releasing hydrogen ions, that means the more acidic you are, the more hydrogen ions you're going to have floating around in that solution. Now, if you think about bases, on the other hand, they do the opposite. They remove hydrogen ions from a solution. So instead of having a lot of hydrogen ions all built up, if you add a base to water, that base is going to absorb hydrogen ions and remove them from the solution. Now you'll see on this slide, it says sometimes this is described as increasing OH minus, which is called hydroxide, increasing OH ion concentration instead of removing hydrogen ions. So I don't mean for that to confuse you, but it is a different way to define a base, and you will see this from time to time. So I do want to just sketch out real quick what that actually means. So if we have a water molecule, and we know very well what those molecules look like at this point. Here's our water molecule. If we have a base, and our definition is a base is something that removes hydrogen ions, that means it's going to take a hydrogen and remove it in the form of a hydrogen ion from that water. Okay, that's what a base does. Well, look at what is left behind. If we remove that one hydrogen, we are left behind with an OH. And it has a negative charge because this hydrogen took the positive with it, but not the electron. It left the electron behind because oxygen likes to keep its electrons, and that means that it left behind an OH. So the more hydrogens you remove from the solution, the more OH you're going to leave behind. So that's why you can define a base either way. It's just two different ways of addressing the same concept. Now the pH scale for a base is going to be anything greater than 7, and it goes all the way up to pH 14. So that just leaves us with our final pH of 7. 7 is neutral. Pure water has a pH of 7. As long as there's no impurities or anything dissolved in it, pure water would have a pH of 7. Now, why is pH important for living things? Remember that living things must maintain homeostasis. So pH is one of those conditions that we have to keep stable inside of our bodies and inside of our cells. So we have things in our cells called buffers. These are molecules that help stabilize pH. And you don't need to know any specific buffer or certainly any specific chemical reaction here for how a buffer works. The only reason why I include this picture on the slide is because the example that I like to use is the pH of blood. So we have compounds in our blood that can regulate our blood pH. So if it becomes too acidic, remember, acids release hydrogen ions in solution. So that means there's a bunch of extra hydrogen ions in our blood. If that happens, then we have a bicarbonate that can absorb those excess hydrogen ions. But if we have too few hydrogen ions, let's say our blood is becoming too basic, so the base is removing all those excess hydrogen ions, then we have a carbonic acid, which is a different form, that is going to release those hydrogen ions. So that system in our body is called a buffer. A buffer is just the molecule that's able to help cells or organisms keep a stable pH. So this first bullet point here is really what you need to focus on here, that a buffer is a substance that can react with an acid or a base to help neutralize it. So that's going to be the end of our discussion about Chapter 2, Section 2. Make sure at this point that you revisit your Power Notes sheet and that you have filled in everything here. Some things were directly from the slides, but don't forget to go ahead and look at the back, answer the questions here, fill in your Venn diagram to compare and contrast adhesion with cohesion, and this is really going to help you reinforce what you've learned today. So I hope you found this video helpful, and as usual, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me.